Hello and welcome, everyone. Today I'm joined by Issayas Yrgaw. Issayas is someone who has a fascinating story. He was born in Asmara in the 1960s, he would have been, and he had to flee Asmara in 1976 after Ethiopian troops killed his father, and he fled Eritrea and went to Sudan, and through Sudan he went to Italy, and through Italy to the United Kingdom, and through the United Kingdom to the United States, where he resides now. And he has written a book titled The Tigrayan Electrician, which is basically an account of the story of his father, who was an electrician in Asmara. And we're going to talk about some of the stories that he has recounted in the book, and it's a fascinating book. I'm going to put a link to where you could buy the book. And thank you for your generosity and for your time, Issayas.
Thank you for having me, Taglai. I really appreciate your time and your effort and the time you took to read my book as well.
Reading your book was an immense pleasure. You know, sometimes people ask me, why is it that I do interviews on this channel? And I reply, it's an opportunity for me to have conversations with interesting people. And if I'm being honest, sometimes that is not the case. You interview people who are really not that interesting. But in your case, it's 100% correct. And as I was flipping through the pages, I was gripped. I finished reading the book in one sitting. It was such I was captivated by your ability to capture the finer details, the finer textures of life in Asmara in the 1970s. And I'm sure our listeners will bear witness to that from the conversation we will have. So it was an immense pleasure for me reading your book, and thank you for that, Issayas.
Thank you for your kindness, Taglai. I appreciate very much.
So maybe we could start with you telling us where you live now, what you do, before we go into the book.
Thank you. So I currently live in the East Coast of the United States. I live actually in Delaware. I have been there now for 30 years. My daytime profession is a surgeon. I am trained in general surgery, although in the last 15 years or so, I have been focusing on what's called bariatric surgery or weight loss surgery, which is a field of surgery that helps people struggling with severe weight to lose weight, essentially. So that's my specialty right now.
And that was after you studied surgery in the UK, after you studied high school in Italy. Maybe tell us a little bit about that journey from Italy to the United Kingdom and then to the US.
Absolutely. So when I was in Asmara, I actually went to a school where Italian was taught as a foreign language. So after I fled to the Sudan, going to Italy was kind of natural for me because obviously I knew the language, and finishing school in Italy was really my first aspiration. So I went to Italy and I finished high school there, but going to university, particularly as a refugee in those days in Italy actually was very, very challenging because Italy actually did not recognize refugees coming from Africa at that time. So the option was really to go elsewhere, and I chose to go to the United Kingdom, where I went to university and studied medicine at the University of Bristol. After I completed medical studies in Bristol, I wanted to become a surgeon, and one of the options was really to come to the United States to train as a surgeon. And that's what I did. I trained in surgery in the United States and decided, obviously, to reside here afterwards.
Well, in the UK, you said that you went to the UK from Italy, and you said that you went there apparently with what was it, with the forged document, or at least your refugee application wasn't accepted by the UK authorities. but as you were waiting in the refugee camp, you were accepted. You were by the University of Bristol.
Yes,
That must
yes.
have been something that was extraordinary in your life. Tell us about that.
So it is, as one of the things I mention in the book is that, we are faced with tragedies and challenges very often, but also on our way, we find goodness in the world, and that's one of the things I wanted to mention, particularly in also tying that up with what I remember about my father, in that he was a very good, nurtured person, it was difficult, obviously, leaving Asmara and going away as a youngster because of the war, because of the atrocities of the Ethiopian government. But one of the things my mother told me, and I mentioned that in the book, is that she was sure that I would find goodness along my way. And I did find many very, very good people as well. And one of them, actually, one of the people I dedicated the book to is Jonathan Musgrave. Jonathan Musgrave was actually the dean of Bristol University at that time. And when I applied to University of Bristol, he was the one who interviewed me. And we didn't talk about medicine. We didn't talk about academics. We talked about books. And I used to love books at that time. And he immediately was taken, by, what I wanted to do. He thought that I would be a very good fit for the medical school at that time. And basically, he told me I would be accepted at the university right there and then at that interview. So that's how I transitioned essentially from being a refugee in the United Kingdom, struggling to get acceptance as a refugee, but at the same time being accepted by the medical school. After acceptance of the medical school, it became a lot easier for me to obtain permanent residency in the United Kingdom, although it took many more years after that to obtain refugee status.
I'm just wondering why they accepted you, because in the book you say that then you didn't speak good English, you had difficulties with the language because you did your studies in Asmara and also in Italy in Italian, and you were at a refugee camp. So it would seem that you wouldn't be an ideal candidate for a university position, but they accepted you. So what did they see in you?
So it is very interesting, right? Before I went for the interview in Bristol, I had already spent about a year in London. And all I did in London at that time was actually go to study English. So I used to go to an English class in a place called Brixton in London. In the afternoon, I would go to a place called Vauxhall, where they had another English class. In the evening, I would go to another English as a second language class in an area called King's Cross. And that's what that's essentially what I did during that year. So there was a lot of improvement in my ability to communicate in English. So I was able to converse with Jonathan fairly well at that time. I cannot say exactly what he saw in me, to tell you the truth, but I do remember having a wonderful conversation with him. And all we talked about was the different books that I had been reading. And I used to read, Russian classic writers, other English writers at that time, because all I had was time, really. So we talked about books, and I think that may have been something that really connected between the two of us. And as I said, he was the dean. He had obviously a lot to say about acceptance in medical school, and that's how it turned out. And then obviously he was very happy that he accepted me, because I did fairly well in medical school after that.
But what was the situation in Italy then that told you that wasn't where you should continue living? Because you described the situation in Italy wasn't really conducive for you, and you had decided to go to the UK. You had to use a lot of tricks, actually. Maybe we'll come to some of them later. But broadly, to our listeners, what was the difference in terms of the dynamic in Italy and in the UK then?
So very interesting. So to become accepted as a refugee, escaping either political persecution or others, you have to go to a country that would have signed what's called a 1957 United Nations Convention of Refugees, right? And many countries did. Italy did not. Italy did not sign that convention, so it was not obligated really to accept people who proved that they were escaping persecution. The only people that Italy made an exception for at that time, interestingly, were Vietnamese refugees. This was right after in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, obviously, and there were a lot of refugees. But so despite the fact that Italy had such a strong historical connection with Eritrea and Ethiopia, particularly because in a way, Italy was responsible for all the upheaval that we've had, following that, you would expect Italy to have been much more receptive to refugees coming from Ethiopia and Eritrea, but they were not. So you could not make a case saying, I'm a refugee. You had to be there either with a visa as a student, as a working person, or as a tourist. And so the only way I could stay there was to have a genuine Ethiopian passport that was stamped by the Ethiopian embassy, and then having my visa status renewed. They call it soggiorno in Italy. It's something that you had to get. So every time I would go to the police station, this was the problem. Obviously, they would want me to go to the Ethiopian embassy and confirm that I was, I had left Ethiopia legally, and that was not possible for me, obviously, because I had escaped. So at some point, I was in a situation where in which either I had to leave Italy, I would face the prospect of being deported either back to the Sudan or to Ethiopia. And England, on the other hand, was one of the countries that had signed the 1957 Convention on Refugees. So provided you had, you could prove that you were an escapee, fleeing political or other persecution in England, you had a better chance of becoming a refugee. So that was why I went to England. And interestingly, though, proving that you were persecuted by the Ethiopian government was very difficult, because at the beginning, my asylum application was actually rejected by the Home Office. And they actually tried to return me back to Italy, but Italy wouldn't recognize me. So I was in a limbo, in a way, waiting and appealing, waiting and appealing. And the acceptance to medical school happened right in the middle of this. And I was actually fortunate enough to get a scholarship also to pay for all my tuition and my living expenses whilst I was studying in Bristol by a charity called World University Service, which is actually based in Sweden. And through that sponsorship, I was able to study. Obviously, it was difficult for me to leave England at that time until I got the refugee status, but at least in terms of continuing the studies, even in this limbo situation, it was possible. And obviously, for a lot of people who have fled, Tigray, Eritrea since then, this is a very common problem, because they would be facing this type of challenges continuously throughout the world, really.
Well, I think maybe the asylum system in the UK then was more fair, because now people the discussion in the UK from the news is that if people were to enter the UK illegally, as they say, they will ship them off to Rwanda. So that is what would have happened to you if it was now. So in that sense, you were lucky. But in another sense, you were not lucky, because reading the book, one thing that stood out for me was you were someone who wouldn't stop at trying, at knocking on every door. In Italy, there is the story that you recount in the book of how you cheated your way into high school because they wanted you to go through the entire high school regime, but you thought that you had already completed some of it when you were in Asmara. So you had to find your way around that, and the way you did that is fascinating. Maybe tell us.
Absolutely. So it's interesting that I arrived in Italy in January of 1979. And as you know, the school year starts in late September, early October. And so I would have been right in the middle of the school year. So the first thing I did was to look for a high school near where I was staying in the center of Rome. And I got to this place, to this school called Benedetto Croce, which is very close to the Stazione Termini in Italy, which is in Rome. And when I went there, the principal was very kind. She was very receptive, but she wanted me to really go to the 11th grade. Now, in Italy, high school is actually 5 years, which means that if I started at the 11th grade, I would have 3 more years before I would complete high school. And as a very, very impatient teenager at that time, I was really keen on finishing school very quickly. So I told them I would study by myself and take the final exam the following June, which I would have been 6 months later. They accepted that, but then they said, I cannot really attend regular classes. If I decide to do that, I would just have to study privately and then sit for the exam. And then I asked them, okay, I will do that, but can they put me in contact with some of the students in the last year of high school so I could study with them? And the principal accepted, and she called somebody from the class. And the guy she called was a guy by the name of Marcello Grana. Marcello was a teenager at that time, a typical kid from Rome. He and I hit it immediately, and he suggested that I would enter classes in a hidden way after the principal left in the morning. So every morning at 8, he would wait for me at the entrance of the high school, and he would lead me into their classroom. And I would be attending class regularly for the 6 months without the principal knowing. And of course, I was studying with them as well. So that's how we did it. And Marcello, of course, is one of the people I had dedicated the book to. He's a very, very good friend of mine, still to this day.
So you still keep in touch with Marcello?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I visit him very often in Italy. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. So you finished high school in this way. You went to the UK as an asylum seeker, and you had a lot of obstacles, and you still got accepted by the University of Bristol, and you completed your medical studies. That's just fascinating for your story, and I hope people would buy your book and read because the details is gripping. The way you navigated your way through the through the system, a very complex system in Italy. And maybe we'll come back to those details later.
Sure.
Because you're having to go through these adventures because you fled Asmara after your father was killed by Ethiopian forces. Tell us why he was killed.
So, first of all, my father was a ordinary civilian, a very peaceful person who looked after his family, who had a regular job, was not involved in politics in any way or shape. On March 28, 1976, an Ethiopian military commander, Colonel Bushu, was killed by Eritrean freedom fighters in the center of Asmara, near a bar owned by a person that I called Elsa in the book, but her real name is actually Neviat. It's a well-known story in the Eritrean history. After Colonel Bushu was killed in the bar, Ethiopian forces surrounded that whole area that evening and killed many civilians. The count is that maybe as many as 80 civilians were killed on that night. And they were killed in a really brutal fashion by the soldiers really forcing their way into the families' houses and executing all the either fathers or uncles or whoever, whatever males they would find that they thought would potentially be sympathizers or participate in what had happened. So the soldiers essentially forced their way into our house, and they shot my dad right in front of his family. And one of the things I emphasize in the book is the loneliness of that night. The loneliness of the night, meaning that we are in a city populated with all the structures, with all the infrastructure, and yet we are alone holding the body of our father. And this is important because once a government sends its own troops to kill its own civilians, then there's no one that can protect you, because the ultimate job of any government is to protect its own civilians. When the government becomes the aggressor, when the government comes after civilians, then there is no hope. And that is what I recount, about that night. And what I remember most is the loneliness. There's really no one to come to help. Of course, other neighbors, other friends cannot come because there is terror in the city. But also, as I say in the book, if you try to call an ambulance, if you try to call the police, no one will come out to aid you because it is the structure of the government itself, the prime aggressor. And I do mention the timing of writing of my book coinciding with the recent genocide in Tigray, right? And why is the timing so relevant for me personally? Because that night of loneliness, was caused by the government itself, right? The government came, isolated us, and killed my father and left us helpless. And that's precisely what they did in Tigray for the last the 2 years in which the genocide was going in Tigray. The government was supposed to be the protector of the people of Tigray, instead isolated the people of Tigray completely and killed civilians, executed youngsters, violated Tigrayan women. And there was no way for the Tigray people to contact the rest of the world, because the only way the Tigray people could contact the world would be through the Ethiopian government. But the Ethiopian government was the one that isolated us. So this trauma that we all went through during the genocide in Tigray, for me personally, had such a powerful reminder in terms of what had happened to me, because my family as a unit, small family, yes, was in a way so analogous to what has happened at a much greater scale to the people of Tigray over the 2 years of genocide. And writing the book at that time in a way was helpful for me, because as many people from Tigray, we've suffered tremendously, during that isolation in which our people were being tortured in such a massive, massive scale.
Well, I hope that writing the book has given you some sort of catharsis. I think that would be and the title of the book, of course, as I said in my introduction, is The Tigrayan Electrician, and your father was an electrician. Tell us a little bit more about your father. What are your memories of your father? What was he like? What was he doing in Asmara then?
So, one of the memories I have of my father is through what other people would say about my father. The first thing people would say was, in Tigrayan, Yrgaw, meaning good-natured, nice person, generous person, and that's what he was. So really, I recount more about, I entitled it the Tigrayan Electrician, but it could easily have been the generous Tigrayan, because he really was that kind of person, extremely, extremely compassionate and generous person, and that's what I remember most about him. He was a family man. There's 7 of us, 7 surviving children, and we were the world for him in terms of wanting us to get educated. He himself never had any formal education. As I mentioned in the book, he came to Asmara when he was really very young and started working and learning to become an electrician there. But he never went to school. He actually learned to read and write, sifting through the pages of a daily paper in Tigrinya that we had in Asmara at that time. And he would read that every day. He had friends that were like brothers for him. This was also the culture in Asmara that I remember. People were just extremely friendly. There was an atmosphere of friendliness everywhere. They could be friends because they live in the same area of Asmara, whether it's Adag Hamus, whether it's Abba Shaul, whether it's Maitamanai, right? Neighbors would be very, very close friends. They would be friends because they work together. They would be employed in the same company. They would be friends because they go to the same church. So there was this very close-knit of social support and interaction in Asmara that I remember very well. So it was a city really almost interwoven into this very, very generous, supportive social fabric, which really was exemplified by, my father's way of living as well, right? Family man, lots of friends, going to church, going to events, and then supporting each other as well. Yes, there were hospitals. Yes, there were other things, but the prime source of support was for the people was each other, essentially. So if something happened to somebody, everybody would know, everybody would go to help. If something happened to their child, if something happened to their father, if something happened to their parents. So this was a very, very integrated society, although Asmara itself didn't have really somebody originally from there. As you may know about the history of Asmara, Asmara really is a city that grew up and was built after the influx of Italians. Originally, it is said that Asmara had no more than a few hundred people. In fact, one of the earlier histories of Asmara is when Ras Alula Banaga went to fight the Italians, and she set up his barracks in Asmara and brought an army of up to 20,000 people from Tigray to be with him. And many of them actually stayed there, and many of them resided there. A lot of people came from other surroundings of Eritrea. So Asmara was almost like an intricate, of people who migrated from other parts, either Tigray or Eritrea, and settled there. But they were people from Asmara. So there was this really very strong social network between people. And that's what I remember. So children would be going to school, mothers would be taking care of the family, fathers would be going to work, and they would be the breadwinners. And then every time there was a problem, they would support each other. Religious differences, identity differences did not come up as much, right? So people could be going to church on Sundays, they could be going to the mosque on Fridays, they would be going to a synagogue on Saturdays, and yet they were all part of the same fabric. And that's what I remember most about Asmara. So extremely good memories about my childhood there, and about my father as well.
And from what I was able to understand, he wasn't particularly political, not in a way that other people were not, because in 1970s, late 1960s, maybe later you would give a bit of context in terms of what the environment was like. But he couldn't have been completely apolitical then. But otherwise, he wasn't uniquely political, but still he got killed in an act of retaliation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, as I said, many of my father's friends were very involved in following up the political situations, and I do mention those things in my book as well. But in a way, very differently from his friends, my father never really said anything about politics. He was all about socializing, about laughing, about having a good time, and about that. But I never saw any political side. So if you ask me what was his political view, I couldn't tell, because I never saw that side, essentially. But he was surrounded by friends who were interested. And when I was very, very young, obviously, I don't remember very much. But as I started becoming a little bit more conscious, I do remember political issues coming up, through the upheavals, obviously, inside Ethiopia in the bigger sense, but also what was going on in Eritrea. In Eritrea, the liberation struggle started in the early 60s, but it didn't come at the forefront in Asmara until really the early 70s, or even the mid 70s, really. It's a lot of people in Asmara knew what was going on, but they were not as involved. In fact, the influx of youngsters to go to the fields to fight with the liberation movements against the Ethiopian government didn't happen until the Derg came to power, which is obviously in the mid-1970s, and the Derg started committing atrocities inside Asmara, atrocities like the ones that involved the killing of my father. And at that time, obviously, a lot of youngsters could see with their own eyes that the result of being under the Ethiopian government was really that kind of repression. And that's when many youngsters actually fled. And as I was fleeing myself to go to the Sudan, there were a lot of youngsters leaving as well. And some of them, as I mentioned in the book, were actually fleeing to go to the fields to fight the Ethiopian government in the mountains, and many others were making their way towards the border like myself. But being a young male in those days during the Derg in Asmara was a very, very dangerous situation. In fact, most of the days you would have to stay indoors. Otherwise, if they see you around in the streets, there were special vehicles that Ethiopian agents would use called the Afany. There was a special unit that would just grab youngsters, execute them, and then throw them in the outskirts of Asmara. And many Eritrean youngsters, many youngsters from Asmara perished in that way. And parents would say, rather than seeing you die this way, they would tell their children to either go to fields to fight or go to the border with the Sudan to escape that. And that's obviously what we did as well. So really, political awareness, political involvement in Asmara didn't happen in that greater scale until the Derg came to power and started committing those atrocities.
Earlier, you said, Yrgaw, that Asmara then was a melting pot of people who came from different parts of the country. And when I say the country, then it was Ethiopia. Eritrea then wasn't a distinct country or a separate country. And indeed, your father went to Asmara from a district in Adwa, in Haida. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But what did the fact that he came from Tigray, what did it mean for his sense of identity? Did it matter that he came from Tigray? So from what you could remember now?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and I've thought about that a lot. So my father identified himself as a person from Tigray without any question, right? And practically, I could see that because he would go to Tigray very frequently. He would take us to Tigray very frequently. Again, I can tell you this sense of identity of a Tigrayan grew up in me because I used to go as a child to Tigray very often. If I hadn't gone to Tigray as much as I did, or hadn't really connections with many of our relationships that were in Tigray, the sense of identity with Tigray, myself and my own brothers or sisters, would not have happened, to tell you the truth. And then obviously another indication is that when my father was, looking for a wife and he needed to get married, he went back to Adwa and got his bride from Adwa. And my mother is from that area. And he obviously brought her to Asmara after that. He did have many among many of his friends, many were originally from Tigray. Some identified openly as he did, and they went to Tigray very often, and others did not so as much. And there was really a mixture of feelings about Tigray at that time. Being somebody from Tigray in those days in Eritrea was colored by the sense of downgrading Tigrayans that started with the Italian occupation of Eritrea, right? Many of the differences that we see between Eritreans and Tigrayans really are the result of the Italian influence in Eritrea, which they sought to separate people who lived in Eritrea as different from the ones in Tigray, right? And this separation was magnified, in my view, by the fact that the Ethiopian government successively decided to impoverish Tigray, right? Deprive Tigray of means of living, so that the Tigrayan homestead were forced really to emigrate outside of Tigray in order to find jobs, in order to find education and other things. And many of those Tigrayans came to Eritrea, others went to the inland into Ethiopia. But also the other thing that happened in Tigray, remember, is there were successive, Tigray-wide famines that occurred, drove many Tigrayans out of Tigray, literally begging for food, and there would be Tigrayans coming to Asmara as well, looking for food. So for many people, the image of Tigrayans were of poor people, people who didn't have wealth, who were forced to emigrate. That was the image that was obviously started with the Italian colonialism, but it was perpetuated because of the policy of Ethiopian governments towards Tigray, right? So there was a sense of shame among many Tigrayans to be identified with that. So even very successful Tigrayans would not necessarily identify themselves as Tigrayans at that time. In fact, many people who worked in very low-paying jobs in Asmara were from Tigray, right? Whether they were picking, for instance, the prickly pear, the billis, and they would sell that, or whether they would be women working in places where they would they would prepare the grain, right? And interestingly, people from Tigray who did these jobs were called agame. So Agame, instead of being the name of a proud region of Tigray, it became a way of really denigrating people. And this type of labeling was obviously magnified because of what was happening in Tigray under the Ethiopian rule and occupation. So on the one hand, my father was very proud and he would take us to Tigray. On the other hand, I could see that there was a lot of denigration of Tigrayans, which is really a mindset that has really pervaded in Eritrea for years. And there may be even now remnants of that mindset. Obviously, things have changed tremendously over the last 30 years because of what Tigrayans have been able to do and what they are doing even now in real terms to really change that perception from people who are naturally impoverished and naturally not educated to people who have an extremely proud history, and that they have been really the masters of the history of that area for centuries before the recent advent of colonialism. So I'm bringing all this to really tell you that there was a mixture of feelings about Tigray and Tigrayans in Asmara, at least at that time. And of course, the current Eritrean government has not helped in this sense, because it has magnified this view and this perception of Tigrayans as people who, with that image really, and hopefully that will change, and it is definitely changing.
Yeah, so it was complex as life almost always invariably is. But for you, Yusuf, Issayas, as you were growing up in Asmara, going to school, socializing with children, was that sense of being discriminated against and sense of being denigrated something that you felt, or you were too young to notice?
I think probably I was too young to notice. I was too young to notice and to understand. In other words, I was very comfortable going to Adwa and to Aksum, in trips that we used to take with my family. And I was comfortable also with my living in Asmara as somebody from Asmara at the time as well, right? The sense of understanding, the sense of this dual identity came up maybe as I was growing up more, and obviously after I left Eritrea afterwards, and got involved more in understanding what was going on in Tigray as well. But personally, I cannot say I have, felt that kind of discrimination. Certainly among my peers at school, this issue never came up. Really and truly, if you look at everybody's background, it was not surprising to see that the vast majority of the people who lived in Asmara have a background in Tigray, and naturally so, because really, as I said before, the city itself had a lot of influence from Tigray from its outset, and obviously the connection between the highlands of Eritrea, in the south of Eritrea, and the rest of Tigray historically have been very solid for a very long period of time. So although people obviously were influenced by the denigration of Tigrayans that has happened since the advent of colonialism and with the policies of the Ethiopian government, it's no surprise that a lot of people from Asmara had a background from Tigray.
You say, Issayas, that until the Derg came to power, there wasn't a dramatic change in terms of the instability and general environment in Asmara. It was after the Derg came to power that people started to openly revolt. Even the liberation movement started to gather momentum after that. But generally, we understand in abstract terms what changed, like following the coming to power of Derg in terms of ideology and in terms of the rhetoric from Addis Ababa and all that. But in terms of the day-to-day life of people like you, father, and your mother, and you people in your neighborhood, what are the things that you remember as changing following the coming to power of the Derg?
Fear came up, right? People were really leading a normal life where they would be getting together, staying up in the evening, going to school, going to work, going to church, going to mosque. All these were normal, everyday things, right? What has changed after the coming to power of the Derg was fear came to the city, right? Because not only now there was, more presence of soldiers in the city, but there was also killing in the city right now. Now, this also coincided with the fact that the Eritrean liberation struggle started advancing from the lowlands of Eritrea towards the highlands as well. So the war came much closer to the city than it had been for the previous decade, obviously. But life started to be really colored by fear, right? Going out in the evening, traveling outside of the city after a certain hour. This became things that didn't happen before. Hearing gunshots in the city is something I never remembered when I was very, very little. And yet, in my teenage years in the mid-70s, it is something that started happening.
Do you remember your father, your family generally listening to radio from Ethiopia, and what the conversations were like then? Did you have any memory of that? I'm just trying to understand, to discern what the family dynamic in terms of their political sentiment and in terms of their fears and worries might have been then in the 1960s and 1970s.
So as I said, originally in the 1960s, when I was really young, I don't remember any type of conversations. But in the early 70s, particularly as upheaval started happening inside Ethiopia, there was a coup attempt against Haile Selassie at some point, either in the late 60s or early 70s. And then obviously all these upheavals coming up with people challenging the rule of Haile Selassie, you could start hearing changes. And of course, the biggest thing I remember was the fall of Haile Selassie, So we grew up thinking that Haile Selassie would be somebody who would live for eternity, right? And yet his rule was obviously challenged. He lost grip of power, and then the military came up. So this was suddenly something that really enveloped everybody's attention and interest, right? And that coincided particularly for Asmara with the advent of the nearing of the liberation movements towards Asmara as well. So there was a lot more conversation about politics. From my father's point of view, I actually don't remember my father saying much about this. That was very interesting. I used to hear politics from my uncles. So my uncles were obviously older than me, but a lot younger than my father. And they would come from Tigray to visit us during breaks from school, and they would talk. And there were actually some friends of my uncles who would come to my dad's workplace and would talk to him about Tigray and how Tigray had been really oppressed all these years by successive Ethiopian governments. That was the first time in which I remember hearing this. And one of the people who used to say that actually became a fighter with the TPLF later, and unfortunately he was martyred soon after he left. But I remember him talking about that. And besides that, really, in terms of my own father or my own family, there wasn't really very much conversation until it became, the war obviously came to our own house, and we became directly the victims of it. And my sense of understanding and realization about politics didn't come about until I left Asmara and went to the Sudan, obviously, where I came into contact with people who, were much more involved in politics at that time.
But in the book, one of the stories that you recount is how the imperative for the struggle against the Derg regime gained momentum in the 1974, 1975, and how there was conversation among people about how to understand the cause of the rebels. And there's a journalist that you mentioned in the book who wasn't really convinced by what the liberation movement people were saying, and I think they killed him. If I'm not wrong, I think his name was yeah, exactly. Yeah, tell me how the EPLF people or the ALF people were perceived in your families and in the conversation that you could recall now.
So interesting. Araya Balai was a journalist, and at that time, what I can remember was his voice. His voice was really majestic, and he spoke this very elegant, fluent Tigrinya, right, on the radio. That's what I remember about him. But also, his killing was a big news, right? I mean, he was killed in an area called Maitamanai, and he was killed, and I think, as it later appeared, he was killed by the ELF, Eritrean Liberation Front. I could be mistaken about that, but that's what I recall reading. So Araya Balai essentially did not believe in the in the movement for total independence of Eritrea. I mean, at least that's what they, obviously he was accused of. I cannot recall, from the content of his speech at that time exactly what he was advocating, because obviously I was not conscious of politics as well. But that was the essence, essentially, right? So one of the things that happened, obviously, that I recall is that, the first thing, one of the things that people saw about the liberation movements is that they could apply justice in the way they saw it right, by, killing somebody who had a different view of them, right? It was an introduction to the liberation movements in a way that it almost formalized or made it accepted for an authority to kill somebody because they had a different view, right? And it may be very important also in terms of understanding what has happened after the liberation of Eritrea, right? Eritrea was liberated by a massive struggle of the Eritrean people, but look where we are in Eritrea right now. Eritrea has been ruled by a thug dictator, who was a hero at some point, right? So where the seeds of what is happening right now sown at that time, right? Yes, if you accept that other people can have different political ideas and let them be and win them over with argument as opposed to with bullets, then obviously the track that you're going to take in the future is going to be different. If you feel everybody should accept your own idea, and if they don't, then they have to be killed or eliminated, then the track that you're going to take is going to be different as well. So that's what I really remember. And I do make a comparison between the killing of Araya Balai at that time and the wounding of another personality in Asmara. His name was Memher Solomon. Memher Solomon was a comedian, and he was a teacher, and he was really shot in a place called it's a lot in outskirts of Eritrea by Ethiopian soldiers. He miraculously survived that, right? But the aim of the Ethiopian soldiers was really to kill him, and they were killing him because obviously he opposed the Ethiopian government's view set, right? And Araya Balai was killed by the rebels because he opposed it as well, right? So here you have then the transformation of this city, particularly of the youngsters, right? Who are looking at a government that pretends to govern them, and yet it kills everybody it doesn't like. And then there are heroes who are up in the mountains. They're saying, if you don't follow what we're saying, you're going to die as well, because they're killing this journalist as well, right? So Araya Balai may have been wrong in his assessment of the Ethiopian government, in his understanding of the venue of Eritrea. But Araya Balai was a huge asset for Tigrinya. He knew the language so well. And he was very young. I think he may have been in his late 30s when he died. What a tragedy, right? What a loss. So that's what I wanted to mention. And one of the things I see is like people like him are almost forgotten. There is no one talking about Araya Balai, for instance, besides leaving aside his political ideas, the fact that this was a writer, he was gifted, he was a journalist, he really was cultivating the Tigrinya language when the Tigrinya language was being replaced by Amharic, is a huge thing. And yet he couldn't continue. He died in his youth, and that's the reason I brought it up. And it's something that really has left a mark in my memory as well.
Yeah, and generally, the people in Asmara then were conflicted in terms of their views regarding the cause of the rebels. I think then they were not saying that they want to achieve independence outrightly. I think it was more what they were saying was that they want to they want to liberate the people. I think that they were using politically safe words generally from what I recall. But anyway, the point I'm taking from this is that their appeal wasn't universal in Asmara. There were people who were circumspect about that.
Absolutely. I think it's the whole history of the Eritrean liberation movement is obviously very complex. You know, there are many facets to it. You could go back in the 50s after the defeat of the Italians and during the British protectorate and see the very lively democratic space that was there in Eritrea at that time. And you had different factions. There were people who were advocating unity with Ethiopia, you know, the so-called unionists, and there were others who were advocating for other, you know, avenues like, you know, Atol Abol de Mariam at that time, who was really advocating for Eritrea to Eritreans. But all of this was playing, and it may still be playing out in many ways as well, right? One of the interesting things that people don't realize is that after the emperor took down the Eritrean flag and abolished the federation and made Eritrea a province of the Ethiopian rule, there was no obvious opposition immediately. You couldn't see it at all, right? The opposition started when Tigrinya was replaced by Amharic in Asmara, right? That's when you started the youngsters coming up and realizing that being annexed to Ethiopia also meant them losing their own identity, right? Because of that intrusion of Amharic in the schools, in the government, and stuff like that. So that's where it started. But until later, the views of where things should go, obviously they were varied. There were a lot of various inputs and discussions. And of course, with the advent of the Derg and the oppression of civilians and the outright, you know, massacres that the Derg was saying, you know, the movement for Eritrean liberation took hold, and obviously the support went that way as well. The relationship of Eritrea with Tigray is complex as well, and that's one of the things that I want people to rediscuss as well. You know, very interestingly, the separation of the people in Tigray and the people in the highlands of Eritrea happened with the settling of the Menelik and Eritrea and Italian accord, right, where they decided to separate these two people and create an entity in Eritrea, and then for Tigray to be absorbed as well, right? But for centuries before, there was no such border. People lived in both places happily without any problem. And then obviously their history goes back many years as well, right? With the advent of Menelik in central Ethiopia and then following him with Haile Selassie, when negotiations were going on as to what should happen to Eritrea after the fall of the Italians, on the one hand, you have the Ethiopian government with Haile Selassie, which is about 700 miles away from Eritrea. On the other hand, you have the Italians who are saying maybe we should reclaim Italy back. But there was no voice from Tigray. This is really the surprising thing. There was no voice from Tigray because any voice from Tigray had been suppressed starting from Menelik and afterwards, and they made sure that there would be no voice. You know, ordinarily you would expect for there to be a voice from Tigray saying, okay, we think this is what should happen to Eritrea because we have a history, right? But there was none, right? So you got haggling and negotiations 700 miles away from the border of Eritrea, but across Merab, which is just a few meters away, there is no voice. There is absolutely no voice from Tigray as well. And that's really the one thing that people don't talk about of the history, really, which is really so important. You know, why silence from Tigray? Well, silence from Tigray is because deliberately Tigray has been suppressed so that it would have no voice as well. And obviously this history is still playing out right now, right, with what happened in the last 2 years and what is playing out right now in front of our eyes.
One of the things that you say, this is something that a lot of people know, is that with the ending of the was it a confederation or federation Tigrinya was banned, and that didn't change when the Derg came, of course. So this was 1974, 1975. But what was school like? What were you taught? I mean, you went to an Italian school, so maybe your case is slightly different. But generally, what was the school like in terms of the language and media form instruction in Asmara at that?
So obviously, I went to a school where Italian was taught as a language. So all myself and many of the kids who went to those schools obviously studied Italian, right? And there was no issue of whether to study Tigrayan or Amharic. But kids who went to ordinary schools run by the Ethiopian government had to study Amharic. In fact, many students from Eritrea who excelled in many other subjects, whenever they competed with other Ethiopian students to go to university, they would do poorly in Amharic because Amharic was not really a language that they mastered, that they learned, but it was imposed on them, obviously, right? And then when the Derg came, this became enforced even more, right? Now it's not just a question you have to do it. It's if you don't do it, you must be an enemy, right? So this imposition of Amharic as a uniform language that Ethiopian rulers had tried to do, starting from Menelik to Haile Selassie and to Derg, obviously, became more and more forceful. So the language really is not a means of communication only. It's really an identity, particularly when it comes to Eritrea and Tigray. It is an identity. I mean, you speak the language because you are a Tigrayan. You speak the language because you are Eritrean. So it's not just a means of communication. And the reason they wanted to impose Amharic and make sure Amharic becomes dominant is because they knew that was one way of really diminishing the identity that these people may have and their connections to the language as well.
So following the coming to power of Mengistu Haile Mariam, the EPLF and generally the rebels become a serious movement. They set up clandestine network in the city that goes around and assassinates people, which is what they did to the colonel that precipitated the killing of your father. And your father is killed in that retaliatory measure by the Ethiopian state. And following that, your mother decides that is not where you should continue living anymore. She decides to send you abroad, and that is why you flee to Sudan. Tell us that journey from Asmara to Sudan. I mean, abstractly, we know we read a lot about how people were fleeing Tigray and Eritrea and finding refuge in Sudan, but we don't quite know what the journey is like. So tell us about that.
So at that time, it was at a critical time in which actually Asmara was surrounded by the rebel forces at that time. The ELF and EPLF were surrounding Asmara. This was in 1977, actually. And so getting in and out of Asmara, you had to go through soldiers' blockades. So I went out with my mother, through the southern border of Asmara. It's called Godaif, and there were soldiers who wanted to know where we were going, and the excuse my mother gave them, or we were going to see a sick relative in Dubaruba, which is a town outside of Asmara. So we left that way, essentially. And as soon as we left, a few kilometers later, in a place called Saladaro, we found that there were, ELF troops. And also there, my mother had contacts with some representatives of the TPLF at that time.
So this is 1977. 1970 in Tigrayan calendar, yeah.
Oh, yeah, right. 1970 the Tigrayan calendar, exactly. So the TPLF was probably about a year or two old at that time. And there were two individuals who were working there. And she asked them, she told them our story. She told them that, she wanted me to go to the Sudan and could they help me go through? So one of them was actually on his way to a place called Shambuko, which is towards the lowlands of Eritrea, but also closer to the border of Sudan. And that's how I got, to be with one of them. His name was Garamedhin. This was a TPLF fighter. And we just went, on foot all the way to a place called Tara Amni. We stayed there overnight. Tera Amni is towards the south part of Eritrea as well. And then from Tera Amni, we went west to a place called Araza. Araza is another small town in Eritrea. And we waited in Araza trying to find transport to go to Shamboko because it's a lot further. And then we found a truck of the ELF that was traveling to the Shamboko and took us there. And Shamboko was a small place around an area where the Kunama people live in the lowlands of Eritrea, and stayed there for a few weeks. And then from there went to a town that was controlled by the rebels at that time, Tessene. And Tessene is basically very close to the border with the Sudan. And that's how we were able to cross. And crossing into the Sudan was a lot easier at that time, because once you went away from areas controlled by the Derg, you would be fine. It's very different for Eritreans escaping right now, because obviously the situation is much more difficult for them to do. But that's how we left. And then once you entered the Sudan, you know, a lot of refugees from Tigray, from Eritrea, from other parts of Ethiopia were there in Kassala, Gedaref, Medeni, and then obviously Khartoum as well.
For your mother, getting you out of Asmara and handing you over essentially to people that she doesn't know, maybe she trusts us, it must have been a painful experience. Do you remember that experience?
I do. I mean, I have children of my own right now, and I cannot imagine letting one of my children at the age of 15, you know, at the age of some forest to go somewhere. You know, I wouldn't even let them travel by themselves, you know, when they were at that age. So I can see how difficult it must have been for my mother as a parent at that time, but also I can see that this was a choice that she had to make because she had no other choices. You know, she had seen, my mother was in her mid-30s at that time, very young woman. She had seen her husband being killed in front of her in her house, right? She's traumatized by that. And now she's worried by her oldest son, you know, going through that as well. So she chooses to do that, to giving me up, essentially. And what I remember at that time is that when we went, you know, from Asmara to this place called Saladaro, it was actually the Ge'ez New Year that day. I believe it was September 10, and September 11 was the next day, which would have been the New Year. So this was at the end of Agmen. So she left us there in Saladaro, and she went back to Asmara, and she told us she would be back the next day, and she would bring something for the festivities of the New Year. And the TPLF fighter who was with me told her, yeah, come back tomorrow, no problem. But then that night, he told me we have to leave. He had something came up, and he said we have to leave. So we left. So my mother essentially came back to Saladaro the next day, and she doesn't find me. And I talked to her about it, you know, afterwards, when I saw her. And obviously she was very, very worried and panicky, not knowing who to ask. And nobody's going to tell her, oh, they went this way or that way, because for security reasons, the fighters would not say where they are heading to. So I can imagine how painful and difficult it must have been for my mother as a parent at that time. And the only reason she really mustered the courage to do that must have been because the other option was, you know, a lot worse for me at that time.
And for our young listeners, there wasn't FaceTime then, so there was no possibility for communication. And in the book, you recount the conversation that you had with the TPLF cadre from where your mother left you off to the border to Sudan. Yeah. Tell us about that conversation.
So that was my first introduction to Tigray, in a way, you know, in a real way. You know, the Tigray I knew before was the one that I would go, you know, with my parents to see family. I would go to Aksum, see the obelisks, and come back. But in terms of what is the history of Tigray? You know, what was Tigray like 100 years ago? What was Tigray like 200 years ago? What was the place of Tigray in our region? I had no idea, because nobody teaches you that in school. Of course, none of the Italian school would teach that, but also the Ethiopian government has this made-up history about the Menelik and how he descended and how Ethiopia had been there, for 3,000 years without really telling us much about the importance of Tigray, right? So the first time I heard about Tigray and the fact that Tigray had been oppressed for the, previous 100 years and then denigrated and deprived and with so many famines occurring, that was my introduction by this young fighter at that time. Telling me all about this. And of course, this was very new for me, but obviously it became the basis for my knowledge and understanding that was reinforced later on. But that was my very first introduction to Tigray and its history.
There's something that maybe I have missed in the book, or maybe you haven't included it, or maybe it's something that you don't want to talk about, but has your mother made it out of Asmara, or should say there? What happened to your mother, to your siblings?
So my mother, went through a lot of hardships afterwards because obviously my father was the breadwinner at that time and he was not there. And of course, there is no life insurance back home. So she was there left by herself to fend for the other kids. So I know, obviously I didn't contact them until, much, much later after I have left. And even after I have left, I was too young really to try to understand how they would be living. It's something that obviously I know for sure now, but they went through a lot of hardships and she stayed there for until another 12 years, which is really the liberation of Eritrea and then the advent of the EPRDF and the fall of the Derg. And that was the first time when I saw her really when she came to see me in England for my graduation. But she really went through a lot of hardship, but credit to her, she was able to keep the other kids together and to raise them. But it must have been very hard, very, very hard for her.
Bless her. And then you made it to the Sudan, and you stayed there at the refugee camp. And I'm going to ask you to tell us about the interesting dynamic and interactions he had with the man that he describes, the thin man at the Italian embassy, and the ordeal that he had to go through to meet your sister at I think in Kassala, if I'm not mistaken. Tell us your experience at the Sudanese refugee camps and life generally in Sudan. What was it like?
Yeah. So my expectation was essentially that I would go to Khartoum. It was hard to get to Khartoum from Kassala, but once I got to Khartoum, I expected to go to the Italian embassy, get a visa, and then just fly. I never really thought for a million years that I would have any problems, once I'm in Khartoum. But as it happened, obviously you have to have a passport, you have to have a reason, you have to have a visa, and obviously I spent really days and days at the Italian embassy trying to beg this guy to give me a visa to go to Italy. And the only documents I would show him was an acceptance letter from a high school in Rome and then the flight tickets that my aunt sent me from Rome at that time. I didn't have any other documents. And obviously,
when you say that, sorry, Issayas, sorry to interject, but for people to really understand, because communication there was completely different. It wasn't emails and all that. So when you say acceptance letter, or when you how did you apply, for instance, to the school? How did you get acceptance letter at the refugee camp? How were these things happening?
So the plan before I left Asmara was for me to go to the Sudan and then go to Italy from there. But the question is, who do I go to Italy? How would I get there? So I had an aunt who used to work in Rome at that time. And we would communicate with her through letters, telling her. So once I got to Khartoum, I wrote a letter to her and say, look, I'm in Khartoum right now. And I need a letter from a school in Rome, based on my documents from a high school in Asmara, that they would accept me. And she managed to get that. It's a letter that any high school would give her, say, yeah, based on his qualification, he would be admitted to our high school. So that letter I had. And then obviously I had to have the ticket, the airline ticket for the flight to Rome as well. And she sent me that as well, and so I had those documents and I would go to the embassy with that. But the embassy, knowing what the situation is, knowing that we were all refugees, obviously was absolutely adamant of not accepting anything. And my experience with this guy particularly was just so bad because At the beginning, he showed no sympathy at all, and then he wouldn't even talk. And then every time I would go, there was like a little window through which you could see his face. He would see me and he would just move his hand saying, go away, like that, you know. But I would go many times thinking that maybe he would change his mind, but obviously that never happened. And there was a time in which actually I gave up completely. And I decided, you know what, it's not going to happen. I'm going to stay in the Sudan until I managed to get some other documents that allowed me to leave. But that was my experience with him. The experience with my sister was different. So after I had managed to get the permission to leave Khartoum, I was wandering in an area of Khartoum called Khartoum Talata, where a lot of refugees would hang out. And there was a little wall called Nda'anudat in Tigrayan. Nda'anudat means people who really don't have a place, right? And people would actually put communication, letters, notes on there to try to find people, because as you said, there was no email, there was no cell phone or anything like that at that time. So people would go there in the hope of seeing some, note from their relatives abroad, maybe telling them that they would send them money or other. I go there and I saw my name, right? And it was my sister who wrote this note saying she crossed the border as well, but she got robbed and she had no help and she was in Kassala right now. So I decided to, stop everything and go find her in Kassala without knowing where she would be. So I actually spent about 3 days knocking on doors in an area of Kassala where, refugees would be working, until by chance, I found her in one house, and then I was able to bring her to Khartoum and then later on to Italy. But that was the story with her as well. And she had to go through a lot of hardship, obviously, to get to Kassala herself, because unlike me, she had a lot more problems crossing the border. As I said, they robbed her and took all the money she had, and obviously she was by herself in Kassala until she found a family that were nice enough to take her on to work for them.
I was slightly. It's something that every Tigrayan would know, the hospitality of the Sudanese people, but still, I was taken aback as I was reading the story. You going from door to door, knocking on each door to literally ask if your sister might be there. And they extended hospitality and sympathy, even though maybe annoyance would have been an unexpected reaction. But that wasn't what you got from the Sudanese people. But tell us a little bit more generally in terms of your interactions and your experiences in Sudan, and how you understood the Sudanese people and what the refugee camps of Tigrayans and Eritreans were like, what the dynamic between refugees and the locals was like. Tell us a little bit more about that.
For us, fleeing from Eritrea, from Tigray, we could not have asked for a better neighbor than the Sudan. I mean, their culture, their hospitality, their patience were just amazing. You could be walking in a neighborhood, and as a refugee, you don't have income, you don't have resources, and yet you don't worry about your next meal. And that is because as you're walking around, people would be eating outside because it's hot, right? They would be having their lunch. They would see a stranger and they would say, "Tafaddal." Tafaddal means come and share the food with us. They don't know you. So you would go there and have your lunch with them. And then at each doorstep, they would have this huge clay pot filled with water. And the clay pot would keep the water really cold. And there would be a little cup with the clay pot. So anybody who's walking would be able to just get some water and drink it. And this would be the house that would keep it there for others. So this was what refugees got when they got to the Sudan, essentially. So the hospitality was tremendous. And when I lived in a place called Hasa, the neighbors were just fantastic. I was quick to learn Arabic. I read and write and speak it very, very quickly. So I was able to interact with them a lot at that time. And even when I decided, to forego the idea of going to Europe and settle there, I was really very, very happy in those days, to tell you the truth. I have since forgotten the Arabic that I learned there, but that I did.
Well, I think you have amazing facility with languages. You have, you learned not learned. Tigrinya was your mother language, your mother tongue, and then you were able to learn Italian quickly to the extent that you were having to. You didn't have any problem having conversations with people at the embassy, including with the thin man. There were other problems with him, but language wasn't one. And English and Tigrinya and Arabic. So that's whatever deficiencies he might have, language doesn't seem to be one of them. I also, one story that made me literally laugh in the book was the sort of the trick, the subterfuge that people had to execute to get documents from travel documents and passports and all that. So would you like to tell us about how you got your passport and how you managed to, secure your ticket and all that to Italy?
So absolutely. So, in the Sudan, all the refugees obviously wanted to go abroad. They wanted to go to America or Italy, but the opportunities of doing that through the official channels were far and few in between, right? So a lot of people, would get passports that were made-up passports and get visa one way or the other. And there was this guy that they call the ambassador, and he was an Eritrean guy in near Khartoum, Talata, and he would just take any passport, would substitute the picture. The passports at that time, they were different from the ones now. They were just pages where you would be able to put the picture of the person, and then the official stamp would be in the corner of the picture and then into the rest of the page of the passports. But he was able to remove that picture, put somebody else's picture, and then redraw the missing portion of the stamp on the new picture, so it looks really perfectly legitimate. Okay, so that is how we would get passports for people to be able to travel. It would be a lot harder now because obviously the sophistication and security are very different, but at that time it was sufficient for people to do that, and people were very helpful to each other, because we were all in the same situation essentially. So information was very easy to obtain on where to go and how to do it essentially. So that's how it was done in Khartoum, but also in Italy. At some point, the passport that I had, I could not really get it legitimized or renewed by the Ethiopian embassy, and I had to rely on getting another one. And there was a similar guy in Rome as well in those days that would be helpful. So when I think about it now, how people did it at that time, I would cringe and how difficult it would be. But when you're young and you are faced with these difficulties and you are driven, obviously, and then people were very sympathetic as well. Whether you are at the border trying to cross, whether you're asking for refugee status, there was a certain sympathy, like the story I tell about that girl in Rome at the airport.
Yeah.
That called the border man.
Yeah. Well, one difference between that and now is, like you said, it would be incredibly more difficult now. But another thing, again, my understanding from the stories is that it was sort of accepted. People knew that was happening, not just the people who were doing that, but even the officials, including the Italian officials, seemed to be aware of that. They seemed to know that people were doing that, and they were lax, deliberately lax about that. That was my understanding. Especially, wasn't there an incident in Italy where the official who was dealing with you knew that your passport was not genuine, but he was sort of fine with that?
Absolutely. And I think, it is part what I call of, humanity everywhere in a way, right? Because people, there is no criminality associated. People were not doing this because of money. People were literally fleeing their homes because they were forced by the, repressive governments that they had, right? I mean, if there was freedom, if there was democracy, if there was opportunities, none of us would have left our homes, because nothing is more sacred than our homes, really. You know, why would go to the extent of learning a new language, adapting to a new culture? You know, you want to do that to visit, not to remain in places that are so alien, right? So instinctively, when people see others fleeing their own homes, there is a certain degree of sympathy. At least at that time there was. And also the official avenues were closed. You know, people who were tasked with enforcing those policies were human beings at the end of the day, and they could see the difference between, you know, something that is criminal and something that is forced upon others. And that's what I saw a lot of sympathy, you know, through my journeys, you know, whether it's in Italy or England.
Well, speaking of sympathy, you recount the story of the sister who came from Sudan all the way to Italy. And her sister in Italy was waiting at the airport to receive her, but she couldn't emerge from the airport lobby, from the arrival section. And then she called you to help her with what was happening there, and you went. And then finally you find out that actually she had arrived, but she was blocked by the security official, because again, she didn't have an authentic passport. She was caught. But after a lot of pleading with the security officer, he sort of relented,
Yes.
and they were able to, well,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was, you know, the sisters hadn't seen each other for about 5 years. So when we went to the area of immigration, that was a secluded area, and they let us there, there was actually a glass wall separating her sister, who was almost in detention, and us. So they could see each other through the glass, but they could not obviously touch, right? So both sisters were just crying and crying and crying. And then I was pleading with this immigration official, saying, look, you know, have a heart, let them through. And that's what I remember very well. And I remember him being very, very upset at the beginning, because he obviously didn't want to deal with this situation. But then in the end, you know, he gave up, he gave in, and he said, okay, here is a passport. And we were able to, both of them actually come out at that time. And again, you know, same thing, you know, obviously, there are official things, you know, you can go here only if you have this document, you can go here only if you have this stamp, you cannot cross this, you cannot go beyond this line here if you don't have these documents. But then when people see the reason you're there, obviously their humanity wins over.
So in terms of your own journey to Italy, you arrived in Italy, your aunt, well, her accommodation wasn't the best, was it? You were having to live in a small apartment, but you managed. You say in the book that it took you weeks to master the, you know, the corners and the nooks and all that of Rome. But what was life like in Rome in 1970? I think it would have been 1978.
79.
79, yeah.
Yeah. It was great. I mean, you know, you would think that, you know, not having the right documents and, you know, not having the resources would be difficult, but it was actually great. You know, as I said, you know, I met some wonderful people like Marcello, who made life a lot easier for me. And then obviously there were Tigrayans, Eritreans who lived there as well, and who helped each other tremendously at that time. So my memories of Rome are actually fantastic, to tell you the truth. Really, really wonderful memories. And obviously I was very sorry I had to leave at that time, but I had no other options. But even as a refugee, even as a newcomer, really, it was phenomenal. It was great.
Well, I think I don't know what Italy then would have been, but I went to Italy in 2012 for my master's study in North Italy, and it's a wonderful country. They are wonderful people, and the stories that you recount in the book also correspond to the experience that I had in Italy, although completely different times and completely different places, because Rome is in the south and Trento, where I studied, in the north. But in terms of the psyche and the mentality of the people, their readiness to help, to welcome you, was with that to see in your case as well.
Absolutely.
So I hope Marcello will listen to this program.
Yeah, I'll make sure. I will make sure I'll send him the link. Definitely.
Yeah. So also, in the book, you write a lot of your sort of philosophical musings about at one point you write about the pointlessness of borders and all that, and of course, Eritreans and Tigrayans have been killing each other over whether the border should be drawn. And for someone who doesn't really believe in borders, and who, again, from your book, it would seem to me that you believe in a borderless world where people could freely move around. What does it make you feel to witness that two people who you are strongly connected to killing one another over border?
Painful, very painful, really, really painful. So as you correctly said, it is an artificial border in many ways in terms of the type of people who live across the borders. Clearly, Eritrea is a nation, a country right now, and of course, as one, it should have its own borders. But in terms of relationship between Tigrayans and Eritreans, there doesn't have to be animosity between these two people for an Eritrean identity to be upheld, or for a Tigrayan identity to be upheld. In my view, the reason we have had so much animosity and ongoing wars between these two people is because it's in the interests of the people who don't like Tigrayans or Eritreans, right? And typically these have been the rulers from Ethiopia who really have done everything they can, and throughout the years, at least in the historical memory we have, starting from Menelik, Haile Selassie, and Derg, to really create this divide that has been perpetuated, really, right? So the war that happened, in Bademe, what a pointless thing, right? What a pointless thing, right? Even if there was massive amount of gold in that town, it would definitely not justify what has happened. It's not only the people who have perished in the actual war, Takhlai, it is really the animosity that is radicalized because of that war. Because once you have friends, relatives, dying in a war, it's very difficult to forget that war. And you're not going to remember kindly the people who are on the other side, because they are the cause of your losses, essentially. So it's almost, something that has been really planted on us for this animosity to last. And I am really hopeful for future leaders of Eritrea and Tigray to really realize this, and that it is in the immense benefit of both people to have peace between these two people. And at the people level, there is actually peace. When the border was opened briefly, I don't know if you remember, in 2018 or whatever, there were massive scenes in which people hugged each other, right? The 20 years in which the border has been closed were just a terrible part of our history, because it didn't really shut down the governments, it shut down the people, and when you build walls, when you shut people off, that's the worst thing you can do in terms of the peaceful coexistence of people. So when I see and live the wars that have happened between Tigray and Eritrea, it is extremely painful. And I really pray and hope that our future leaders of these two countries, Tigray and Eritrea, will be really, really focused on creating peace, first and foremost, between Tigray and Eritrea.
Well, I should let you go, Issayas. You've been incredibly generous with your time. But if I could get your reflection on one or 2 points. Your father was killed as an act of retaliation by the Ethiopian forces, and of course that same act of retaliation was perpetrated by Eritrean and Ethiopian forces against Tigrayans in Aksum and a lot of other places 2-3 years ago. How did that make you feel to witness that something that happened to your father was happening to you fellow Tigrayans 40 years later?
Traumatic, extremely traumatic, right? Because as I said earlier on, there was an eerie analogy between the night I spent holding my father's body, when he was killed, isolated completely, and what I imagined the people of Tigray were going through, totally isolated, not just for one night, but for 2 full years. It's not just isolation and deprivation of provision, but it's also fear, killing, sexual violence perpetrated day in and day out without anyone coming to their aid, right? And the tragic situation about that, it is happening really utilizing Eritrean forces as well. So enemies that would want us to stay divided are purposely perpetuating this as well, right? So I think for me, it was one of the most traumatic times I've had since I left home, to tell you the truth. The 2 years have been extremely difficult. And in a way, writing this book, as you said, was cathartic, not only towards, the trauma I've had in childhood, but also towards trying to understand and overcome what was happening to the people of Tigray, right? The way forward is very important to me. All the actors that were really responsible in directing, executing all these violations and massacres and genocide have to be held accountable. There is no way out without doing that. This is extremely important for the people of Tigray and for the people of Eritrea. Once that is done, reconciliation and peace between Eritreans and Tigrayans is an absolute must, not only for us and our children, but for our region. I think our region will be much more peaceful if this reconciliation happens. Reconciliation does not mean we have to have one country or anything like that. Far from that, right? We can be two countries that cooperate, whose people live working together. I went to a meeting not too long ago where somebody was talking about building universities at the border, where people from both countries would go and study, where children from both countries would study together. That's the kind of future that is important for us. But we cannot get there unless we actually find and seek justice as well, because what has been done in Tigray is probably the greatest genocide of the 21st century. And the reason people in the world don't know that is because they don't know about it. You know what I'm saying? Otherwise, I don't think any of the conflicts that are happening, whether in Ukraine or in the Middle East, come even close to really compare to the casualty of civilians and suffering of civilians that has happened in Tigray from 2020 until end of 2022.
And in terms of your father, Issayas, of course, as I said earlier, he was born in Haile, and you write incredibly beautifully about Haile, about the daily routine of life, about what the people's houses look like, about the church masses, the service, the ritual. I don't think I have read descriptions of the Tigrayan. The sort of the typical Tigrayan household, how it looks like, what goes on there, as beautiful as they have done. So thank you for that. But in terms of the story that your father told you about his birthplace, about Haile, what do you remember him telling you about his memories, about what life was like for him in Haile? And maybe you could add your own experiences or your own memories of those places.
Absolutely. I have had actually the fortune of visiting Haile and Forasmai back in 1975, so a long time ago. Great memories, though, great memories, going up in the hills of Haile or the valleys in Forasmai, wonderful places. And of course, I remember, what my father used to tell us about his brothers, about his childhood there as well, which were really wonderful things as well. The one thing I regret, to tell you the truth, is not having been able to visit Haile with my father. That would have been really great. I have not had the opportunity to do that. But, the memories of what he told me, the memories of what I have of Haile still remain, obviously, and I'm really grateful for that.
Well, thank you. It's a beautifully written book. And one thing that I would say is that I have a childish love for literature, and I could feel that love as I was reading you book. They say that one of the great marks of great writers is that they make you see, you know, the details. They make you feel as though the experience also belongs to you. When people speak about Dostoevsky or people like that, for instance, the reason people think they are great writers is that they, you know, so for instance, they make you as though you have been to the streets of Moscow. They make you feel that. They make you see things that you haven't seen actually, but that they give you that sort of delusion. It's a delusion in a sense. And he gave me that experience. Now I feel as though I have been to Asmara. I feel as though I have been to Kumbishtato. I feel as though I have been to, what was the name of your school? Otto, Santa Otto, I think. Yeah. And it's an incredibly beautiful piece of writing, and I strongly recommend people who have the means to buy the book and to read it. And I think you have done your father proud. You have made him proud. He will be looking down on you and being incredibly proud. So you should really be proud of yourself, Issayas, and thank you for inspiring us really to want to write our stories as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you for your generous comments, Taglay. I appreciate very much.
So thank you, everyone. That was Issayas Yrgaw. Please, as I said, read his book, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Until next time, that was it for today, and bye-bye.